Bible in the 21st century. In this series of presentations, I've been looking at what the Bible teaches us about end times. We've now reached the final presentation, where I'm going to attempt to bring it together to give an overall picture as given to us by the biblical text. We're dealing with issues like the final judgment, the return of Jesus, a new heaven and earth, resurrected life. They've got that rather fancy name, eschatology. What will happen at the end of time to this world, to evil, to Satan, to ourselves? Very big questions for us to face. Jesus returns. We're going to look at the evidence that Jesus will return. Mostly we're going to base it on the biblical text, but we're going to take into account evidence that comes from the scientific world and the historical world. But in the biblical text, we're going to look specifically at what Jesus taught, as well as what the wider New Testament reveals. It was not an issue in the Old Testament. We did look at prophetic passages, but they don't relate to end times. How could they? That would have had no meaning for the people who were the first listeners, long before the days of Jesus. We're going to look at evidence. In all of this, I've invited you to weigh the evidence. Look at what I present, read it up, read around it, think about it, discuss it, talk about it, even argue over it. Weigh the evidence. What is the picture that the Bible presents to us? The teaching of Jesus. Now there's a real problem here. I've based it on Matthew 24. There are parallel sections in both Mark and Luke, but I based it on Matthew because it's the most complete. It's the longest presentation. And there's a complete confusion. The first 35 verses of chapter 24 are describing the temple destruction and the wipeout of the land and the people. And the language shows it. The language changes at verse 36, and that bit comes to the return of Jesus and the events that will follow it. Once we get that sorted out, an awful lot of things make complete sense. But there's complete confusion, and it comes up in books, sermons, all over the place. A simple look at the language makes it very clear. And what Jesus was saying is, no one can predict when it will happen. There'll be no warnings at all. Look at the last part of chapter 24. He spells it out crystal clear. So we've got to live in the here and now, expecting it at any time. But the quality of our living is critical. Again, something that Jesus stresses the end of chapter 24 and through chapter 25. There can be no signs of the times. It's a total misunderstanding. We can summarize it this kind of a way. Jesus taught that his return would be dramatic. There would be no warning signs, totally unexpected, but there's a kind of paradox built into the teaching of Jesus. Could come at any time, but there'll be delay. And so often the truth lies in combining paradox. That's our task, and that's the real message for us when we look at end times. God has given us things to do. We've got to get on with it. But when he comes back to put things right. This world is so full of things that are wrong and so full of injustice. He comes to put things right. Our actions in the here and now have consequences in this. We could end up our lives consigned to total loss. That is a frightening thought. Or we could end up in resurrected bodies to a transformed new quality of living. That's a wonderful thought. And Jesus pictures it clearly in the parables in chapter 25. Our actions have consequences at every level, in every way. That is the meaning of judgment. Judgment means that Jesus comes to put things right and there will be justice. So often so many people in this world today suffer total injustice and unfairness. Jesus comes to right things and put things correct. That's the true thrust of judgment. But there will be consequences for our actions, and Jesus makes it very clear. That's the basis of how Jesus judges us and sorts things out at the end of time. We are judged by how we treat other people. And the reason for that is how we treat others is the great indicator of what is within us. That's the outward evidence of the transformation or otherwise that Jesus has achieved within our lives. How we treat others. We don't know. We do know he will come, but we don't know when. And to talk of signs of the times or make predictions contradicts what Jesus himself taught and said repeatedly. There are no warning signs. There's this paradox between delay and it could come this afternoon, this morning. But what we do with our lives now will have consequences in the hereafter. And the evidence of lives transformed lies in how we treat others. Now let's look briefly at the teaching of Paul. He emphasizes Jesus died and rose again. That indicates that the followers of Jesus, we will all be resurrected, and there'll be total equality at the resurrection. That addresses a confusion that was amongst the followers of Jesus in the little town of Thessalonica. That's his key teaching. That's the key emphasis. In resurrected bodies, we will be with Jesus forever, in a new quality of living, whatever that may be, wherever that may be, however we may find it and understand it. But it will be a new quality of living, but it will be with Jesus. Paul very often is addressing areas of confusion rather than giving systematic teaching. In this, he's stressing that Jesus will return. And it will be very, very dramatic and obvious. All mankind will see it. Those who have died will be resurrected. Those who are still alive, all followers of Jesus, will join them. There's total equality. But that's the key message that Paul wants to give to these young followers of Jesus in Thessalonica. Hang on. When he comes, he will take us to be in his presence. Paul is absolutely clear-cut. He will return. It will happen. And the timing is utterly unknown. There are no warning signs, no signs of the times. But for the followers of Jesus, don't be afraid of this. In resurrected bodies you will be with him forever. In a sense, which is what Paul is saying, you know when it comes to the timing of the return of Jesus that you do not know, and you cannot know. But there's nothing that should generate fear within us. It should be a positive spur forward to quality living for Jesus here and now. We are secure in him. This runs in parallel to and expands what Jesus himself said about that day as his return or hour. No one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And if Jesus doesn't know, how dare we say there are signs of the times as if we know? Jesus said, for as lightning that comes from the east is visible even to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. My return will be dramatic, and all humanity will see it. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. We have responsibilities. Our actions have consequences. We have responsibilities in the here and now for how we spend our time. Paul stresses that the very fact that Jesus was resurrected means there's the template. We shall be resurrected. Jesus shows what it will be and presents this wonderful hope and picture for us. Tying it in with what John says, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. We shall be in resurrected bodies like Jesus, and we shall see him as he really is. It's a kind of model for us. What a picture that gives us a positive hope and reassurance. Looking at what John contributes. John was very aware that that was happening in his day. It's happened down through the centuries. Some people say Jesus was just a human being. You've heard it, I've heard it. Some say he was the founder of the Christian religion, a common media view. Some argue that Jesus was temporarily filled with the Holy Spirit. But he's just a human being. There are many people try to explain away his miracles in amazingly contorted ways. Some deny his resurrection ever took place. The evidence is overwhelming. Not proof, but overwhelming evidence. But many deny that all the fullness and nature of God rested on Jesus, and that's what John was addressing so strongly in his first letter. But you see, what John says is when Jesus returns, we shall see him as he really is. Human beings may argue all sorts of things, but when it comes to the crunch at the end of time, when he returns, humanity will all see him as he really is. A great confirmation and encouragement. John wrote the long letter which we call Revelation, which is a word which translates the word apocalypse. We looked at this in some detail. We, followers of Jesus, and indeed many people, have generated utter confusions in trying to make sense of this book, forgetting that it was written in a particular literary style which doesn't exist today. And we have created all these millennialisms, pre, post, A, and many followers of Jesus just opt for the main road, a road of lostness. It's just confusion. And there's all sorts of things written and said and sermons proclaiming strange and bizarre views with great dogmatism, all unhelpful. Does not take us forward and does not help us to live for Jesus. What do we make of this mysterious 1,000 years? That's the point that John is making. He's speaking to people who either have got relatives and friends who have been martyred or who themselves are facing the likelihood of martyrdom. How were they going to cope? What did this mean? And he's pointing out that martyrdom leads to the chaining of Satan. When there are martyrs and great persecution, the kingdom of Jesus grows as Satan is changed. The eyes of people are opened to the truth. Always happens. And John is picturing eventually that Satan will be eventually chained completely and totally and destroyed. The martyrs are part of the process. The principle is Satan is bound by martyrdom, and it all follows the greatest model of all, the ultimate martyrdom. Jesus did it on the cross. He spoke about the cross, and he said, when I am lifted up, the prince of this world will be brought down. Satan was chained when Jesus died on the cross. And when people give their lives for Jesus, Satan is chained. The kingdom spreads. Jesus is made known. That's the key point that John is making. He's addressing it to a real situation, horrendous situation. And he's lifting the lid and showing what's really happening in the spiritual realms. And when we go down these speculations, we miss it. And we argue all sorts of things which signifies nothing. John never mentions the return of Jesus in the context here at all. He mentions 1,000 years, which is a symbolic number. But he never mentions the return of Jesus. He mentions the 1,000 years many times. We're missing the point. It's all just human speculations, and it does not help us. Peter, we didn't look at this before, because much here summarizes what we can see in the teaching of Jesus, Paul, and John. But let's look at the key passage from Peter's second letter. But do not forget this one thing, dear friends, with the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. That fits in with the insights from the sciences. We were created within time. Time is not quite as what we think it is. And in God's economy, He created time for us, and time for Him is rather different. But the day of the Lord, that's the coming of Jesus, will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. Coming like a thief, no warnings. He's saying the same as Jesus, the same as Paul, the same as John. And that's just pictorial language. Don't take it literalistically. He's using the language of that time. The key point is nobody's going to miss it. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and speed its coming. Here are great life implications for us. A call to live the way of Jesus. But in keeping with this promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. Same picture that John brought, and the word new, same word John uses, is in the sense of being transformed. However we understand it, our physical world will be transformed. God made it and it was good, very good. We've messed it up. He will transform it. And it's impossible for us to understand exactly at this point in time what that will mean. Focus on the last bit a little bit more. It's an interesting thought there. We're awaiting, but also hastening the presence of the day of the Lord, the return of Jesus. It's a thought we need to talk through, pray through, and seek God's will on, but by the way we live, what we do, how we treat each other, we are hastening the return of Jesus, or otherwise. But we're called to look forward to it, but also speed its coming. Very deep, interesting thought. John spoke of many antichrists. In the literature, it tends to be an antichrist, but that's not consistent with what John says. He uses the plural. Paul speaks about a man of lawlessness. In the Revelation, John describes the work of the two beasts. Now we know what the two beasts are because it's clear from the book. The deification of secular power, in his case the Roman Empire, corrupted religion and false spiritual leadership, both of which we can see today. When they combine, they force people to worship the state system in some way. Oh, you can see it in some of the totalitarian states today, and it edges into some of the Islamic states as well. Is it a principle here that the Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, and the two beasts are different ways of picturing similar things? A principle here? In all of this, there's nothing specifically related to end times. None of these things are a sign of the times. There can't be a sign of the times, because otherwise we could begin to predict when Jesus will return. Jesus says we can't. John is writing in a period between the resurrection of Jesus and his return. And both in John and Paul, they're speaking of a spirit of rebellion against God. I've used the phrase antichrists. People who undermine the true power of Jesus, undermine the true identity of Jesus, undermine the achievement of Jesus, and they create deception, delusion, and confusion. And it's still happening today. And it's nothing specifically to do with the return of Jesus. This kind of violent resistance will simply keep reoccurring until Jesus returns. Jesus brought Satan down on the cross. He's now limited in power and he's thrashing around, trying to undermine all the glorious work of Jesus and humankind throughout the world. This is part of it. He works through people, he works through systems. And you can't use this as signs of the times. So we have many antichrists, a picture of a man of lawlessness, the two beasts of Revelation, Antichrist, the phrase preposition anti could be against or replacing. Both are seen. This is personified rebellion, and this is the deification of secular power and corrupted religion and false spiritual leadership. When they get together, it's a heady mix, and the people of God suffer. And we'll get these repeated upsurges of evil like a volcano that erupts periodically. Look down through the history of the world since the days of Jesus. You can see it. The upsurges of evil. And then it becomes quieter for a while. Then another upsurge, usually within a state system or religion or an individual person. That's what they're driving at here, these authors. Let's just look at a few warnings, because this world of end times is full of things that are simply nonsense. They don't fit the biblical pattern. First of all, let's look at prophecy. Prophecy, prophets inspired by the Holy Spirit spoke the mind of God for listeners, and they're speaking in a specific situation, a specific context. They're saying, if you keep on doing this kind of thing, that consequence inevitably will be. This is what God is saying to you. And it may illustrate deep spiritual principles. So we've got to ask, when was a prophecy spoken, where, to whom, why, and how would it have been understood by the original hearers? The problem is this: people take prophecies and rip verses out of context to prove almost anything they want to prove. Prophecies are not and never will be celestial timetables. That's not the nature of prophecy. And there's been a lot of abuse of prophecy down through the years. Someone said that if John chose never to mention the return of Jesus in relation to the 1,000 years, why do we spend so much time arguing about how they relate to each other? We're just wasting our time and causing divisions. Why do we rip a verse or a small section out of its context? It leads to utter confusion. That would happen with any book. We must interpret things in their context. End times, we've hardly mentioned hell. Most of the modern understandings are just simply religious folklore. There's not a lot about hell in the Bible. You may be surprised for that. Indeed, the word translated hell in the Old Testament doesn't refer to hell at all. It's a mistranslation. The word means the shadowy place of the dead. They had no clear concept of heaven and hell in those days. And the word that's used mainly in the New Testament has got the same meaning. It's a word that comes from the Greek language. It means the shadowy place of the dead. There's a second word which relates to a fire or a rubbish dump where things are burned. So much mistranslation of the original language. But there is that analogy in the second word. But fire destroys, not tortures. It burns up rubbish. That's what God's goal is, if we are but willing. But where humans persist in rejecting all that Jesus is and has done, they've cut themselves off from all that Jesus can do for them. And in the end of time, they suffer separation and utter loss. We humans were made for relationship with God, our Heavenly Father. To be separated and face the utter loss of everything we've stood for. That is genuinely a hell. But very different from the kind of pictures of folklore. The idea of the rapture? Let's be honest, it's simply a human invention. And it came from the 19th century. It's modern. And it came out of some followers of Jesus who took the Bible literalistically. They didn't look for context. They didn't look for how people understood it at the time. They just lifted words out, and in the culture of that time they decided what it meant. And the basic idea is that the believers will be snatched away from this earth at some time up into the sky. And it's based on what I can only call a naive misunderstanding of two verses. Let's look at them. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken, the other left. The problem is this: in the original language, we don't know who gets the benefit. Is the taken person or the left person in a preferred state? But you see, verse 42 shows what Jesus was saying. Keep watch. You don't know what day your Lord will come. You could be doing the ordinary things of life. Some will be ready, some will not. That's the point that Jesus was making. Nothing to do with any rapture. And in 1 Thessalonians, after that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so will be with the Lord forever. The problem with that is, build a rapture around that verse, it ignores the cosmology of the day. Where God was seen up there, it was a flat earth, and we're down here. So if we're going to meet Jesus, it's a halfway house. It's going to be between up there and the flat earth, in the air. It's not literalistic at all. It's a picture with a principle. And if you go to the next verse, it shows the real significance. Encourage one another with these words. Paul was writing to people who were starting to doubt if Jesus would return. Other people have said, well, he has returned, just haven't noticed it. He's making the point. Everyone will see it, and we will be with the Lord forever. You won't miss out, whether you're alive or dead when he comes. That's what Paul is driving at. And he's answering a problem these young followers of Jesus had at the time. Back to our human invention. Now, if you look back in history, what it did was, in the 19th and 20th century particularly, repeatedly led to individual people publicly publishing the predicted date of the return of Jesus down to the nearest hour. And of course, every prediction was wrong. Now, what does that do for the reputation of Jesus? Why are we so gullible? Brought no honor to Jesus. It just made the biblical text a laughing stock in the mind of the wider public. It also made the followers of Jesus look very foolish. And indeed, it generated some new denominations being formed, creating even more splits. It's done nothing but damage. So this leads to the question, if these things fly around, how do we know what's true and valid? How do we sit the examination paper? Well, the Bible gives us 2 tests. Does it bring honor to Jesus? And John works that out in his first letter. Does it generate quality living? By their fruit you shall know them, said Jesus. There are 2 things, and most of these speculations have not brought honor to Jesus. They've made the way of Jesus a laughingstock. It has not generated quality living, it's generated arguments and splits. There we have the evidence. The New Testament evidence of the overall picture. Jesus will return. It'll be dramatic. Everyone will see it. No warnings whatsoever. He'll bring the affairs of a fallen world to a final end. He will inaugurate a transformed heaven and earth. And it's difficult to know exactly what that will be. We shall live in it with Jesus in his presence in resurrected bodies if we followed him. And our future is secure, and justice will be demonstrated for the injustice that happens so often in life. And evil will be banished forever. There's the overall picture. These are the key things for us today. That's the key thrust of the biblical message. We needn't be fearful. The new quality of living is wonderful. And we'll live in a totally transformed world, whatever that may mean. That all goes. And all the things that haunt us today, that mess up our lives, gone forever. What a beautiful and wonderful picture. Resurrected life, the key thing is Jesus will be central, and the relationship with God will be fully restored. The relationship that was broken in the story of the Garden in Eden, when humankind decided that they could run their lives their own way, decide their own destiny without God. It'll be a life of security and peace, and life quality will be transformed, brought to its total fulfillment. Ideas we could do without, these are all misleading. It's an impossibility. If Jesus doesn't know when he returns, speaking as the human being on this planet, how dare we say that we can predict it? That's just a human invention, misunderstanding biblical text, ripping them out of context. This misses the point of what John is driving at. Why argue over something that John doesn't address? And the return of Jesus is unconnected with anything that may happen to Israel. That's another make-believe, which we looked at previously. Ask the questions. The tests. Do any of these ideas bring glory and honor to Jesus? Look at history and you can see they've done nothing but damage, and they have not generated higher quality living. Reject these. They don't pass the tests, and they misrepresent the biblical text. Challenges for us today? Let's be very careful that we get our picture of hell more balanced. That is a very real hell. I can't understand, and no doubt you can't understand exactly how awful that will be. But we just leave that in God's hands. For the people of God who are seeking the way of Jesus, that is not an option. And let's remember, the basis of judgment isn't on the basis of our correct theology. And churches that put up statements of beliefs and you've got to sign in, we've got that completely wrong. We are judged on the basis of how we treated others. Oh, we've got to look at that in our Christian communities. The reputation of the people of God down through history has not always been good, and it still is not good today. But the greatest challenge of all is this: are we living ready for his return? And are we living for Jesus and his agenda, not what we want, but what he wants for us? That's the picture Jesus gave. We fulfill our God-given responsibilities faithfully, whatever these may be. You may think it's unimportant. You may think you're unimportant. No, you're not. We're all important equally. We have responsibilities that God has given us. If you're not sure what they are, pray, seek them out. Work and pray through with friends that you trust, and find out what God wants you to do and be. Is that your agenda? Is that my agenda? Whatever thing we do, how we spend our time, how we spend our money, what are our priorities of life, it's all governed by this: what brings the benefit to others. Not to me and my family, but to others. whether they're in this country, wherever you may live, or in the wider world. That's the great challenge of the return of Jesus. And we finish with that, because that's the central thrust of biblical teaching. It's positive, it's affirmative, but it's also a challenge to us for our daily living today.